The room had not changed. Time had only settled on it, a thin gray layer that softened the edges of everything left behind. A faint beam from the cracked window fell across the floor, touching the outline where the body had once rested. It was not a stain now, only a difference in color, a shadow of memory pressed into worn boards. The air felt muted still. Dust floated like pale fragments of the past, unhurried, drifting. The silence held its own weight, almost physical, as if something inside the walls was listening. I stepped in without sound, letting the door fall closed behind me. The metallic click echoed once, then faded. The place had been cleared years ago, but the absence carried its own presence, a whisper of what had been missed or misunderstood. Cold cases have that quality. They linger, they resist. They wait for someone patient enough to return and look again. That was why I came back. Not nostalgia, not duty, something quieter. The case file rested under my arm, the edges softened from handling. I set it on the old wooden table where sunlight reached only partway. The dust stirred as it landed, rising and settling again. The table creaked from the shift in weight. Her name had been Seraphine Dale, 29, a voice coach who had lived alone, known by neighbors mostly for her early morning walks and her porch light that stayed on through storms. She had no record, no conflicts. Her life had turned quiet, then ended even quieter. The lack of disruption had been the strangest detail. No noise, no struggle noted, only the aftermath. I touched the first page of the file. The paper felt dry, slightly curled. Old reports often take on a texture similar to the memories they hold, worn but stubborn. I flipped it open and stopped at the photograph clipped to the inside. A simple apartment interior captured on a disposable camera. The light had washed the center, leaving the edges darker. Her arm, barely visible near the corner. The original team had noted nothing unusual. I studied it again. Dust, angled shadows, furniture that looked slightly shifted, but perhaps that was nothing. The floor beneath my feet creaked, a measured, tired sound. I walked through the room slowly, as though approaching a place where something sacred had once been kept. Old apartments carry scents longer than they should. This one held a faint trace of paper, varnish, and something dry, like forgotten cotton fabric. My steps took me to the narrow hallway. The light didn't reach here. Only the soft outline of the wall switch stood out. I didn't touch it. Artificial light felt intrusive in a place where the past had frozen itself deliberately. In the hallway, remnants of tape marks still clung to the baseboard, the original perimeter. Small rectangles where corners had been documented, measured, doubted. I crouched, letting the beam from the window follow the line of the floor to where the hallway met the living room. A shallow indentation marked the wood, a pressure point long softened. The impression of a dropped object. Round, maybe. Heavy enough to speak, light enough not to break. I closed the file and placed it on the ground, flipping through the pages carefully. Statements from neighbors, routine, predictable. No loud noises. No visitors. No unusual activity. Each line carried the tone of people trying to help but holding nothing. Then a small note halfway through, not part of the initial report, a different handwriting, slanted, thin strokes. Guest seen once early month, tall, quiet, possibly carrying case. No date, no signature, no follow-up. It had been overlooked or dismissed as irrelevant. I traced the ink lightly. The stroke pattern suggested hesitation, as though the writer wasn't confident in the memory. I checked the timestamp on the following page. It belonged to the first detective on the case, Darryl Vaughn. He had retired before I joined the department, and the file had transferred through several hands. Each investigator had added observations, but none had built enough momentum to reopen it. I exhaled slowly, letting the air settle. Seraphine's world had been small, yet something had entered it. something that left without making noise. I returned to the living room. The slanted sunbeam had shifted, revealing a thin line on the far wall. At first glance, it looked like a scratch. I stepped closer. The paint had been marked by a clean, straight edge, about 5 inches, parallel to the floor, a scrape caused by something smooth, possibly a case like the note had suggested. The angle indicated removal more than arrival, something taken out rather than brought in. I leaned in, letting my fingers hover but not touch. The scrape was old. Dust had settled into it. Years of stillness preserved it better than fresh paint ever could. I backed away and returned to the table. The file pages rustled quietly as I flipped again. Photographs of the wall were included, but the light had hit differently then, and the scrape had not been noticed. A detail too small, too ordinary. Seraphine's background file lay near the bottom. I pulled it out and read through it again, reading not for facts but for patterns. She had left a vocal arts program after a minor setback, choosing to teach privately instead. Several clients, a modest schedule. One client had canceled the last 2 sessions before her passing. The name, Ilson read. No address listed, only a phone number long inactive. I searched for additional notes. Nothing. The room around me felt even quieter now, as if waiting for a conclusion I had not yet earned. A soft buzz came from the hallway. My phone. I reached for it, glancing at the screen. The forensics archive clerk responded to my earlier request. Pulled box. Old prints fragile. Come when ready. I slipped the phone back into my coat. Before leaving, I scanned the room one more time. The beam of light no longer reached the place where the outline had once been. The dimness returned, restoring the room to its long-held stillness. I stepped out and locked the door, letting the silence reclaim what it needed. The drive to the storage facility passed without much thought. My mind kept returning to the scrape on the wall, to the note about the visitor with a case, to the indentation in the floorboard. Each detail on its own was small. Together, they formed something like a pulse, faint but steady. Inside the archive building, the air was cold. Concrete floors amplified every footstep. The clerk nodded at me without speaking and guided me toward a metal shelf where a single cardboard box waited. The label read, Dale, S. 2005 print/misc. I thanked him quietly and carried the box to the small reading desk in the corner. The fluorescent light hummed above me. I opened the box carefully, removing a stack of envelopes filled with old fingerprint lift cards. A few had faded, others were partially smudged. The first set belonged to Seraphine, the second to officers. The third set, unlabeled, contained prints from an unknown source, partial, incomplete. The records had been scanned years ago, but the resolution at the time had been low, and the prints were considered unmatchable. But something stood out now. The ridge patterns repeated in 2 separate lifts, taken from different parts of the apartment. One near the hallway light switch, one from the back edge of the table. The angle suggested deliberate placement rather than incidental contact. Someone had touched surface points that suggested awareness, not accident. I took out my notebook and began to draw the pattern lightly. As I did, the clerk passed by, paused. "You're rechecking that case." His voice was low, respectful. "Yes," I said. He nodded once, continuing on. I kept sketching, letting the lines settle in memory. The pattern wasn't distinctive enough to identify without deeper analysis, but it told me something else. The visitor had touched the table while standing on the opposite side from where Seraphine usually worked. That indicated direction. That indicated purpose. I closed the envelope and returned the box to the clerk. Stepping back outside, the late afternoon light felt softer. The cold case file under my arm felt heavier, though its weight hadn't changed. Cases do that. They shift when they begin to move again. I returned to my car, placed the file in the passenger seat, and sat for a moment, listening to the quiet hum of passing traffic. There was something about the scrape on the wall that kept pulling me back. Not the mark itself, its alignment. A rectangular case, likely carried upright, would strike the wall at that height only during removal. But why would someone remove something from a vocal coach's apartment? Something stored, something long. I considered her teaching notes. Seraphine used standard sheet music binders, nothing that required a large case. Unless it wasn't hers. The idea formed slowly, like ink seeping across thin paper. A visitor carrying a case not belonging to the victim. A case heavy enough to leave an impression on the floor if set down. A case removed after the incident. That meant something had been brought in and then taken away. I didn't know what yet. But the scene held its clues like quiet witnesses. They only needed another look. I started the engine and drove to the last recorded address of the canceled client. It was not far, a small row of studios once used by freelance instructors, later converted into a storage corridor for unused equipment. The windows were dusty. The sign above the door had faded letters, barely visible. Inside, the space smelled of cold metal and paper. Rows of instrument lockers lined the corridor, some locked, some open and empty. I checked the registry mounted near the entrance. Names etched on small plaques, some scratched out. One near the bottom, read I. The locker door for that unit had been left slightly ajar. I pulled it open gently. The hinges groaned. Inside, a cloth cover lay folded, thin and creased. Beneath it, the outline of a missing item was visible. The dust pattern indicated something long and rectangular had once rested here for years, leaving a clean rectangle surrounded by a darker border. The case, it had been here. I ran a fingertip along the dust, feeling the contrast between clean and settled particles. Something had been taken out not long after the incident, maybe the same day. I crouched and looked closer. On the inner wall of the locker near the very back, a faint mark curved upward, a subtle arc, a pressure scrape from the tip of something metal. I stepped back and inhaled slowly. The air tasted dry, like forgotten storage. Something in this locker connected directly to Seraphine's apartment. Something brought in, something removed, something that left quiet marks in two spaces years apart. My phone buzzed again, a short message from the main office. Vaughn left a box on retirement, may have case notes, unsorted. A new lead, unexpected but logical. I closed the locker slowly, letting the echo settle into the corridor. For a moment, I listened to the stillness. It felt like the story was beginning to move, not in leaps but in measured steps. I walked back outside. The day had begun to dim. Shadows stretched across the pavement. The air held a kind of suspended quiet that made every sound, even the soft click of my car door, feel amplified. I placed the file beside me again. Seraphine's photograph slipped loose and landed on the seat. Her face in the picture was calm, almost serene, eyes steady, a quiet strength. "Seraphine," I murmured, more a breath than a word. Then I drove toward the office, the past moving with me like a faint outline in the rearview mirror. The office lights were dim, most of the staff already gone for the evening. Retirement boxes from old detectives were usually stored in the internal archive room, a place filled with mismatched shelves, cardboard stacks, and the light smell of dry glue from old tape. I pushed the door open, letting the motion sensor activate the weak overhead lamps. They flickered once before stabilizing. Along the far wall stood a row of boxes marked only with names and badge numbers. I scanned for Vaughn. It sat on the third shelf, slightly tilted, as if someone had returned it hurriedly. I lifted it down and set it on the center table. The box wasn't large. A simple cardboard container with worn corners. Inside, a stack of spiral notebooks leaned to one side, next to a small voice recorder, and an envelope sealed with a thin strip of yellowed tape. The notebooks were dated, some scribbled through with tight handwriting. I flipped to a page labeled with the year of Seraphine's case. Vaughn's writing was sparse, fragmented, sometimes a full sentence, sometimes a single phrase floating mid-page, as if the act of writing was less about organization and more about capturing instinct before it faded. One line caught my attention. Case visitor, unknown. Pattern suggests prior connection. He had circled the word prior, then drawn an arrow to the margin where he added, "Not random, intent quiet, nose layout." I ran my finger lightly along the margin, tracing the faint indentation. Vaughn had guessed early that the visitor had not simply stumbled into her apartment. But after that note, his thoughts drifted to other cases, other entries, as though he'd never returned to the thread. I turned to the next page. A small, clipped photograph was taped there, the same image of the apartment corner from the official file, but this version had markings. Vaughn had drawn a rectangle around the shadowed area near the wall and written, "Case rested here." The question mark suggested uncertainty, but the underlined word suggested something more. He'd suspected the rectangular outline represented an object that had been placed deliberately. I reached for the sealed envelope next. The old tape cracked as I peeled it back. Inside were 3 items: an unlabeled key, a small folded sheet of paper, and a photograph of a locker corridor, the same studio building I had just visited. Vaughn had been there, nearly 2 decades earlier. The folded sheet contained a single note. Locker 14, empty when checked, dust pattern inconsistent with long-term vacancy. I exhaled, the realization settling in. Vaughn had seen the same discrepancy I had: the clean rectangle in the dust, the shape of something long and stored. But he hadn't pursued it further. Maybe his caseload had pulled him away. Maybe the lead had felt thin then, or maybe he'd lacked the detail to bind the pieces. I examined the key under the desk lamp. Old brass, no label, could be for a storage locker or something inside that locker. Its teeth were jagged, worn slightly as if used repeatedly at some point. I pocketed the key and placed the notebooks back into the box. Then I checked the voice recorder. The battery had long died. I removed the back and inserted a fresh one from the desk drawer. The screen flickered, showing a cracked timestamp. One audio file remained. I pressed play. The recording began with low static, then Vaughn's quiet voice. "Field note, Dale residence follow-up. Something off with the table position. Not sure if relevant. Apartment feels staged in calm way, not cleanup, just presence missing. Visitor touched the table once, left print on far side. Checking studio building later today." Static again. Then the faint clatter of movement, maybe a vehicle door shutting. "Not sure who I'm looking for. Something about the case shape bothers me. Too long for sheet music. Too deliberate." The recording ended abruptly, as though cut off mid-thought. I rewound it and listened again, catching the subtle emphasis he placed on deliberate. I set the device down and leaned back slightly. The room's quiet made the hum of the overhead light feel louder. Vaughn had followed a line of reasoning that had sparked the same unease in me. But he hadn't had access to modern print analysis or updated databases, and the case had cooled before he could conclude anything. I closed the box and left the archive room with the key in hand, the thought of the locker's missing item occupying my mind. Outside, the night had deepened. The street lamps cast soft gold circles on the pavement. I walked to my car, feeling the weight of the investigation settling more solidly now. The pieces no longer floated separately. They leaned toward each other. At home, I placed the key on the kitchen table and opened the case file once more. Seraphine's details sat on the first page. Age 29, voice coach, a quiet life, a brief list of clients, a schedule noted in her planner. I scanned the client list again. Ilson read the canceled sessions, the unfamiliar name, the possible link to the locker. I searched older digital records, a faint trace connected to a small ensemble that had disbanded years ago. Red had been a cellist, though not a professional one, more hobbyist than performer. That matched the size of a long rectangular case, a cello case perhaps. If Red had stored his instrument in the studio locker, then retrieved it around the time of the incident, the pattern aligned. But the question wasn't the instrument. It was what else a case like that could hold, what could be brought in quietly and taken out just as quietly. I closed the laptop slowly. The refrigerator motor clicked on behind me, adding a faint hum to the silence. I rubbed my thumb over the brass key. The teeth shimmered faintly in the overhead light. The next step was clear. I returned to the studio building the next morning. The hallway looked the same as before, dim, quiet, stale air. Locker 14 waited with its door slightly ajar. I inserted the key. It fit smoothly, turning with a soft metallic click. The lock engaged and released perfectly, suggesting the key belonged here. Inside, the dust had settled further overnight, but the clean outline remained. I knelt and examined the corners of the rectangle, noting where the dust darkened slightly inward, as if the object had sat at an angle at some point. A slight tilt, pressure concentrated on one edge. I searched the locker floor more carefully this time. A faint line caught the light, a thin streak of dried varnish, amber-colored, barely noticeable. I touched it lightly. Hard, glossy, not from the locker itself. Varnish used on wooden instruments, or on something wooden stored inside a case. The streak seemed accidental, as though something had brushed the locker edge during removal. I stood and reassessed the space. Measuring the rectangle with my hand span gave an estimate, about 4 feet long, maybe a bit more, broad at one end, tapering slightly. It could match the footprint of a hard cello case or something constructed with similar proportions. On the back wall of the locker, I noticed another faint scuff, a straight line, vertical. The casing of the object might have rested briefly against the wall, but then something else. Near the bottom corner, a soft gray mark like graphite. I leaned closer. Not graphite residue from tape. A small piece had once adhered there, then been removed, leaving a faint tacky residue. Something had been labeled, something stored with intention. I closed the locker door quietly and turned the key again, letting the soft metallic sound settle in the still air. Back outside, I called the main office to request Red's last known address on record. The clerk located a form with an old rental contract from 2004. No later entries. The address belonged to a complex on the outskirts of town, half vacant now. I drove there. The building stood with its pale siding weathered balconies empty. The number on the door of the listed unit had faded. I knocked. No answer. Through the window, the room looked empty. I turned away, noticing a mailbox cluster near the lot. Some rusted, some missing doors. Red's name was worn but still legible on one. Inside, a single envelope sat at the back, yellowed and curled inward. I retrieved it carefully. The postmark dated from last year, surprising for someone who had seemingly vanished. The envelope bore no return address. Inside, a single folded page. For when you return, left what mattered in the music. No signature, the handwriting small, angular, something about it felt familiar. I compared it with the note from Vaughn's envelope. Different writer, different pressure, but the tone carried a similar restraint. I slipped the page into the case file and returned to the car, the message repeating in my mind. Left what mattered in the music. Not literal music, perhaps, but something contained within something associated with music. A case, a storage locker, a removal timed precisely with the incident. I returned to the precinct. The evidence review room sat quiet, its shelves organized, its steel tables cold under the fluorescent lights. I requested the property logs from the year of the incident. An officer retrieved them, long sheets of handwritten entries from stored materials. A notation stood out. Unidentified wooden piece, retrieved from Dale residence, no matching inventory. The entry had no description, only a vague mention of wood, size small, status unassigned. The officer brought out a small box marked with the same date. The tape was old but intact. I opened it. Inside was a wooden sliver about 3 inches long, thin, slightly curved. Its edges worn. I held it to the light. The surface bore traces of varnish, matching the amber tone I had seen in the locker. The underside showed a faint imprint, a pressure groove in the shape of a strap bracket often used inside instrument cases to secure the neck of an instrument. This fragment hadn't come from Seraphine's apartment daycare. It had broken off from something brought in, something that had since disappeared. I placed the fragment on the table and leaned forward, my hands braced on the cool metal surface. A line connected the object to the locker, to the visitor, to the scrape on the wall, to the indentation in the floor. Logical, sequential, quiet, nothing coincidental. I made a call to a retired conservatory technician I knew, someone who had repaired cases and instruments for years. He met me at his workshop, a narrow room filled with hanging tools and faint wood dust. I placed the fragment on his table. He examined it through a magnifier. "Old case interior," he said softly. "Support bracket likely from a hand-built piece, not factory, custom." "Custom for what?" I asked. "Could be for a cello, could be for any long wooden object needing stability." He angled the piece. "But this wear pattern suggests it held something heavier than a bow, something dense, balanced toward one end." I watched the wood glint faintly under the workshop lamp. He continued, "This was secured for travel. Someone built this case carefully, purposefully." I thanked him quietly and stepped outside again. The afternoon light cast narrow, slanted beams across the pavement. The wind carried the scent of dry leaves and distant asphalt. Case custom built, stored for years, removed during the time of the incident, a visitor with a case, dust patterns, scrapes, a missing object. Seraphine's calm apartment, no sign of struggle, no noise, no trace of forced entry. The case had been the focus, not her belongings, not the apartment. Something inside the case, something important enough for someone to retrieve it even after all this time. I returned to my office and studied her file again. A detail caught my eye, a note in her planner indicating review session, private piece. No further explanation. The date matched the week before her final days. A private piece, something she was asked to review, perhaps something hidden inside a container disguised as an instrument case. And if she had discovered its contents, or had been entrusted with something she wasn't meant to keep, The visitor's silent presence made sense. I sat back, letting the weight of the conclusion settle in layers. Something stored, something transported, something custom, something missing now. But what exactly had been inside? The answer would not come from speculation. It would come from the logic she left behind. Quiet patterns, small traces, residues, alignments, gaps. And somewhere in that sequence, the truth waited. I looked again at the photograph of Seraphine. Her expression held a calm confidence. Something in her eyes suggested she had understood more than she ever spoke. And perhaps she had left something behind, not in sound or written notes, but in silence, in the absence of a thing once kept near her. The case had left the apartment, but the reason had not. Morning light filtered into the office, pale and diffused through the high windows. It softened the outlines of the desks, filing cabinets and dust motes drifting like slow-moving fragments of memory. I sat with the case file open in front of me, Seraphine's photo resting beside the wooden fragment and the unlabeled brass key. The pieces formed a quiet constellation, scattered but connected. The missing object inside the custom case remained the center of everything. Whatever had been stored there had driven someone to retrieve it with precision, leaving almost nothing behind. No noise, no disruption, only the faint marks of movement. I needed to understand the layout of Seraphine's apartment again, not as a crime scene, but as a place where something had been handled. Something inserted, removed, set down, lifted. Something that produced a scrape on the wall and a dent in the floor. I returned to the apartment that afternoon. The landlord had given temporary access for the case review. The hall smelled faintly of old paint and quiet years. When I unlocked the door, the same hush greeted me. The air felt untouched. I walked to the wall where the scrape sat. The line, 5 inches long, faint but clear to anyone who knew how to look, stretched parallel to the floor at the exact height where a long case might have brushed past. I crouched, aligning my eye level with the mark. The angle slanted slightly upward, a subtle rise. That rise suggested the case had been lifted while being turned toward the hallway exit. I stood and followed the path the visitor would have taken. From the wall, across the living room, to the narrow passage. The indentation on the floorboard near the hall entrance waited like a quiet echo. I stepped onto it lightly. The wood sank just enough to feel the weight memory left behind. A heavy object set down momentarily, then lifted again. I imagined the visitor's movements, entering with the case, pausing near the table, possibly showing Seraphine something inside. Then leaving, the case now heavier or lighter depending on what had been added or removed. The question lingered. Had the object been placed inside her apartment briefly, or had something been taken from her and hidden inside the case before removal? I scanned the room for anything overlooked. The table stood in the same position as shown in the old photographs. I felt along its underside. A small notch, 2 millimeters wide, sat near the back corner, not from the table's construction, a pressure mark, something metal repeatedly pressed against it years ago. My attention shifted to the box of Vaughn's belongings in my car. He had been close to seeing the pattern. A case stored for years, removed abruptly, something left behind unintentionally, the fragment. I stepped back outside and drove to the workshop where the conservatory technician worked. His room smelled of pine dust and old varnish. Tools hung on the walls like quiet observers. He glanced up as I entered, found something else. "Maybe," I said, placing the table photograph on his bench. He studied it, the mark on the wall too clean for furniture, something smooth, hard. "A case," I said. He nodded, "likely, Custom ones often have metal edges that would leave a scrape like this. I placed the wooden fragment beside him again. He picked it up. "This piece is from inside the case, but look here," he said, pointing at the underside. "This isn't from holding a traditional instrument. The pressure groove is off-center. The weight distribution is different." Meaning? It held something dense, not curved like a cello neck, something straight. Compressed fibers show repeated contact, like it rested there many times over years. "Something stored long-term," I said. "Yes," he replied. I thanked him and stepped back into the sunlight outside. The answer hovered at the edge of understanding like a faint silhouette, straight, dense, heavy enough to mark a floorboard, varnished wood inside a custom case but not an instrument. I returned to the precinct, entering the evidence room again. I asked for older property logs connected to Red, not directly tied to Seraphine's case, but stored as miscellaneous. After a long search, an officer returned with a smaller folder. Inside were 3 photographs from a routine welfare check conducted years before the incident. Red had once stored various wooden items in his apartment, carved beams, decorative panels, and one item noted as long wooden bar. No further description, no photos, only a hand-drawn outline. The outline resembled a straight rod, about 4 feet long, with squared ends. It could fit in the case. But why store a wooden bar? And why remove it around the time of the incident? Unless the object wasn't decorative, unless it served a purpose known only to the visitor. I sat with the outline, tracing its shape in my mind. A wooden bar with dense weight, varnished, custom case fitted with interior brackets. The thought formed slowly, carrying a quiet impact. Not a weapon, not a tool, something else. Something constructed to hold something inside itself. A container, a hollow wooden bar sealed beneath varnish. A place to hide something long, narrow and valuable. If Seraphine had opened it, if she had discovered something hidden inside it, the visitor's quiet urgency made sense. I drove again to the studio building, this time walking the entire hallway, scanning each locker, checking the dust patterns. Locker 14 was the only one with an outline that suggested long-term occupancy followed by abrupt removal. The rest had uniform dust. Inside the locker, I examined the back corner again. The faint graphite residue line wasn't random. It had been the outline of a label at one point, a paper or tape marker indicating contents. I angled my phone's flashlight. A fragment of adhesive remained. Faded lettering under dust, one pen stroke still visible. A straight vertical line, could be part of a letter, could be the start of an I or the start of a number 1. I closed the locker and sat on the hallway bench, letting the silence settle. The low hum of an air duct vibrated faintly. The stillness carried an answer waiting behind it. Back at the apartment, I walked room by room once more. The faint smell of old wood and dust felt heavier now, as if the place carried its own quiet breath. I returned to the living room, standing where the visitor once stood. I pictured Seraphine, calm, observant, perhaps curious when she saw the case. Maybe she had asked about it. Maybe she had been shown something. Or maybe she had been asked to keep something safe. Her planner entry, review session, private piece, might not have referred to music at all. I imagined her hands touching the wooden bar, noticing its weight imbalance, its faint seam, its density. Maybe she had tapped it lightly. Maybe she had heard the hollow tone inside. Maybe she had opened it, discovering whatever had been embedded there. And if she had understood what she was not meant to understand. I walked to the kitchen area where a narrow drawer sat partially open. I hadn't checked inside before. The original search didn't note it as relevant. I pulled it open fully. Inside lay old renter debris, paper clips, dust, and something else. A single metal pin, thin and smooth, barely 3 centimeters long. It rolled when I touched the drawer's edge. A latch pin. The kind used inside certain types of wooden containers to secure sliding compartments. I picked it up carefully. The weight and size matched the kind used inside custom-made hollow bars, mechanisms designed to hold objects in place inside disguised casing. This pin didn't belong in a kitchen drawer, not unless it had fallen out of something. Something taken out in a case. The logic crystallized slowly, piece by piece. A custom hollow bar stored for years. A visitor retrieves it. The bar had contained something small but important, something that required a latch pin, something that Seraphine may have seen or discovered. If she had been entrusted with the bar or curious enough to examine it, she might have opened the hidden compartment. Whatever was inside had significance, enough for someone to retrieve it urgently. I turned the pin in my palm. Its surface bore faint scratches from long use. I struck it lightly against my notebook. It made a sharp, clean click. A sound that would have been unmistakable inside her quiet apartment. Maybe she opened it. Maybe she heard something shift inside. Maybe the visitor realized it later. The next step was clear: identify where the hidden compartment might have been inside the bar. But the bar was missing now. Removed, gone. Yet the latch pin remained, unintentionally left behind in the drawer. I returned to my office, placing the pin beside the wooden fragment. Their alignment made sense. The groove on the fragment corresponded to the place where the bar would have rested. The pin matched the kind of locking mechanism built into custom containers. I studied Vaughn's notes again. His uncertainty, his instinct that the case visitor had been deliberate, his suspicion that the object inside the case didn't belong to the world of music. He had been right. The arrest that finally came nearly 20 years after the cold case froze wasn't sudden. It was quiet, procedural, almost anticlimactic. The suspect, located through updated fingerprint mapping, matched the partial ridge patterns lifted from the table and hallway switch. A retired ensemble member, a quiet man who had once used the studio locker, someone who had vanished from public records for years. He didn't speak much, only fragments. I kept it safe. Didn't think she'd look. Didn't mean for it to end. His voice remained steady, not defensive. The words held no confession beyond acknowledgement of presence and intention. The object, whatever it had been, was never found. He claimed it was gone long before authorities traced him. Maybe it was true. Maybe it was. The official record closed with procedural clarity, but the true story, the small, quiet logic of how it had unfolded, stayed with me. I sat in the old apartment one final time before signing off the case. The air hung still. The scrape on the wall caught the last light of day. The indentation in the floor held its stubborn outline. The drawer sat half open, empty now. Seraphine's presence lingered in the room's silence, not as a ghost, but as a memory of someone who noticed something small, something hidden, something that mattered. Cases end but not cleanly. The paperwork completes. The arrest is filed. The system marks the task as resolved. But in the stillness of the room, I felt the quiet pulse of something unfinished. A faint human truth that wouldn't be captured in any report. Justice had moved, slow, mechanical, inevitable. But something softer remained, something that belonged only to her. I closed the door gently behind me, letting the silence reclaim the space.